This is a broadcast on behalf of SHARE, which is a pan-European project of which Wise Age, a 50-plus voluntary organisation, is the UK partner. Today's theme is the experience and attitudes that all of those of us participating in the meeting have had in relation to exclusion, discrimination, and just the general different experiences arising from the different perspectives of men and women, from people from different ethnic backgrounds, and also for people with different hair colour. So I'd like to start off the conversation by introducing myself. My name's Chris Walsh.
My name is Valerie Small.
I'm Dominic Wren.
I'm Vinnie Dillon.
I'm Peter Lyons.
Okay, thanks for that. So let's get into the general conversation. From my experience in relation to gender, there's been an enormous transformation of the lives of women and men over the last, certainly since the 60s. I think that when I think back to my mother, who was an extremely experienced, highly qualified and highly paid professional insurance seller with her own car before the war, when she got married to my father, the first thing he demanded was that she gave up her job. Therefore, the family income went from above the national average in one fell swoop, as my dad was a factory worker, to far below the national average. My mother never murmured a word of complaint and put up with it. I think that this is the sort of situation now which would be nearly impossible to find.
My experience was kind of the opposite in a way. My mother had 7 children. My father worked as a kind of railway executive, and my mother kind of had a career as a primary school teacher. But the reason that she was able to do that was because my grandmother, her mother, lived within the family. And that enabled my mother to be able to go out to college, do her teacher training, and actually have a professional life as well.
However, the stats say that over 50% of all people who are carers are women aged 50 to 65 who care for their elderly relatives, or care for the grandchildren, or children with disabilities. And so there does seem to still be an ongoing role for older women, maybe people, grandmothers, in relation to staying in and looking after the home.
I mean, is this something to do with age? Because, last night I was in a friend of mine's house. The husband, who maybe won't be alive this time next year, we don't know, he's 80, his wife is 12 years younger. And there's quite often, it's rare that you find it the other way round, that the man is 12 years younger than the woman. So partly this is to do, I think, with age. The women are younger and therefore haven't died off. An awful lot of children aren't able to live within easy reach.
Yeah, I think globalisation has meant that a lot of people are now travelling. I mean, my parents, they never moved where they were living apart from the war more than 40 miles. I've moved around a lot within the UK. My children have all got experience of travelling and working in countries all across the world. But on the other hand, I mean, what the breakdown of, I think, the families are concerned is, one of the stats is that there are 1 million women of pensionable age living in isolation on their own, family breakup, or the men have died, in poverty. And in poverty because they've not been able to get appropriate pensions and employer pensions, and they're all on their own.
I wondered if for some women that's possible as well, but I wondered, say, for some women, my mother came and she was widowed. She came to England when it was full employment and was invited as part of the Commonwealth, and then was widowed at 26 and had 4 young children. She had to also work. Her mother came over to help raise us. She worked, had 2 or 3 different careers. But by the time she was in her 60s, she was really glad to live by herself and not have people making demands on her. And if you were a man, you were not allowed to come into her flat and say you were hungry. She was a bit idiosyncratic because she'd had this quite isolating experience on one hand, but she had freedom that she wouldn't have had in India.
Well, I can step in here from talking from inside the Caribbean community because I grew up in the Caribbean, and I grew up in the cliched extended family, in which my family prided itself on always knowing 5 generations. And that's still my daughter today knows 5 generations of her family. I mean, she not by name, she can actually touch them, hug them. There's always 5 generations of my family still existed. Then I moved over here, and one of the biggest adjustments I had to make when I met people at school here is that they didn't know who their grandparents were, or they knew who their grandparents were, but they didn't see them. Whereas where I grew up in Jamaica, my great-grandmother, my grandmother, my mother, you could stand in one house and you look towards and the children moved around. So if I'm coming from school and I'm tired one day, you stopped at the nearest relative. You didn't necessarily have to go to your parents. So that was norm for me. But like Vinny said, my mother came here for economic reasons, to work. And they did not recruit families. They recruit, and a lot of people had to deny that they had families in order to get the passage to come here to work. So you had to deny your actual family. So my mother came as a single person because that's what the contract asked for. And a lot of other Caribbean, and it was predominantly women at that time because they were funny enough, the educated ones were the women in the Caribbean when my mum came in the 60s, because the men were still in agriculture. So my mother had gone to school, so they were the ones who were recruited. They came into the nursing profession. Because they came with being
health visitors and things
so there was a complete contrast to Europe, where the women were educated there and not the men. So this whole idea of the close family that I grew up in, that I took for granted, wasn't there. So we had to, in a way, recreate the family extension to fit into this society here. With great difficulty. You spend a lot of time travelling. That was before everyone had a phone.
Well, one of the first ways that when they had the Silver Surfers training, one of the first ways they got the over 65s in was actually by saying, look, once you can understand how to use email and everything, you can keep in contact with your family, which they did, and which suddenly meant that their isolation, in terms of of people with global family networks, was massively
I dispute that.
improved.
It would only work if you were globally in a developed country where you had the internet.
I was wondering if things are starting to kind of shift back the other way now towards, are we going to have slightly more extended families than we had before, living in as a family unit? Because housing crisis, it's impossible for children. It's very hard to buy a house now and actually become independent. I left home when I was 17. I think it's quite interesting what you were saying about the whole thing of growing up amongst a very closely knit family and a close community. I think a lot of people quite enjoy escaping from that and finding a kind of coming to the city and finding
autonomy.
a kind of autonomy and anonymity.
Yes.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting because, I mean, people who were growing up in small towns and villages, they were desperate to, I mean, one of the reasons you went to university was to escape, and they were desperate to go into the big city. And of course you still find, I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that you'll find people, the gay community are more prevalent in big cities because it's a place that you can not get the same level of discrimination. And yet, for somebody now reached my age, I can't wait to get back to a nice, relaxed,
We're like that
little
now.
community in a village.
You know everyone.
I was
and everyone says good morning.
That is so true, because when I came here, I was 12, just going to, I was pre-teens, and the freedom, it was actually being liberated, because I could actually walk from school to somewhere else, and I did not have these telegraphic people along the way keeping an eye on me.
Sure you're not doing
but I don't know if it's a certain age now, I'm really desperate. I find myself seeking out distant cousins that I've lost contact with. to try and get back, that network of family back again. My mother just got up one day and said, I've had enough, and she's just gone home and reconnected.
It's great that she managed to do that, because I think a lot of people in her situation never actually make it back.
My father's experience was very different to my mother's, but he did die in the early 70s. He came and was very isolated, and they set up and were part of the Indian Workers Association. So the men had, which was based on the Wobblies, wasn't it, in America?
Yeah.
And so they had groups in Birmingham, Wolverhampton, and when I've looked now at the back at the minutes, you can see they worked locally, but they also thought globally, were part of this political organisation because they had to, because they were so badly treated, even though they were invited over. So he had an external life that my mother didn't have. So I thought that was interesting too, about how people cope with their discrimination in different ways. You can either isolate yourself or join an organisation. There was the Caribbean equivalent too.
I think my mother's age group, they cope by just ignoring it. But interestingly,
I think also that's with the trade union experience is interesting, because in the 50s and the 60s and into the 70s, they were bastions of racism because they were defending the white working class.
So they had to organise separately.
And they were bastions of sexism.
Yeah.
And so really it wasn't until late 70s,
the 70s,
early 80s.
the feminist movement, putting it on the agenda, I suppose.
But also the black separatist movement, where and then as a result of that, by the end of the 80s, the trade unions could reasonably, in general terms, be put on the side of the good guys.
20 years ago, there was a masses of factory employment in this area.
That's true.
It's gone. It's gone from every part of central London, or even peripheral parts of London. But by that, a lot of employment has become based on knowledge.
Would you disagree with the idea that I would suggest that my experience of life in London in the beginning of the 70s and experience now is that there is much more integration? I mean, there are much more women employed in all types of jobs than you see. For example, the idea of getting on a bus and having a bus driver who's a woman is now normal. It would have been quite remarkable 20 or 30 years ago.
Well, it's now illegal to discriminate in employment if the discrimination's based on sex. And also because women can choose to have children or not now, and that wasn't the case when my mother had me.
I think there are changes, but I think a contributory factor to that is that there are a larger percentage of people of ethnic heritage are actually born in this country. Yeah. I am not from the Caribbean, I'm from Brixton, I was born here. Yeah. So stop referring to me, saying that, you have to deal with us as somebody who's from here, not write us off as somebody who's from over there.
Well, I think the discriminations have changed, actually. I was thinking about this. I was thinking about the discrimination of my father, who was Polish and came to Britain after the war, post-war, 1947. And I'm comparing that now with the sort of dislike of Eastern Europeans that we're all experiencing because of the economic migration that's going on. And the form of it's changed now.
Wanted to know whether we could move on to the hair colour bit of the discussion, because I was really fascinated by how that came up as a topic.
Yeah.
I'm 50 now, and I'm looking at the fact that there's going to be an absence of colour in my hair.
But if you want to example on the street of racial discrimination, hairdressers is the most obvious, clear and present danger.
Why don't each of us just do a quick summary of what they feel personally has changed for them in the last 30 or 40 years?
I mean, for me, I was brought up in my Caribbean home to look forward to getting old. Being older was seen as an achievement. Having lived in London and having looked after people who have become older, the one thing that terrifies me about getting old is being totally dependent on other people for all my care. That absolutely terrifies me. And I wish that if that time approaches that I'm not here, I do not want to be in that situation in England.
I find it quite difficult because I'm part of a generation that think because they get older, they know how everything should be done and how everything should be, and they don't realise that young people don't see it like that, and so I feel a bit out on a limb somehow.
Yeah.
For me, I feel I've led the life of an older woman even when I was younger because I was a carer. So I feel like I've had an old woman's existence, and now I'm older, I can be more out about being a carer, because when I used to go for job interviews, I felt I had to hide this part of me because there's something, people don't really like the word carer, and there's a lot that people in this country don't find a burden to think about caring, being a carer, being cared for. That's a crisis in this country, I think.
Mm.